How many wellness brofluencer podcasters does it take to screw in a light bulb? 3. 1 to film it, 1 to sell the ancestral light protocol, and 1 to warn that light bulbs are like seed oils for your eyes. I'm Matthew Remski. That was an Antifascist Dad joke, and this is the Antifascist Dad Podcast, Episode 5. Big episode today, a little bit longer than usual, no guests. This week, it's just all me and my review of a new book that I believe will be making a huge splash in the broader English-speaking world, but especially among U.S. liberals and Democrats who are trying to figure out how they're going to win back male voters from the Trump movement, and in that quest wondering whether they can get away with offering little more than self-help and capitalism pep talks from mega-wealthy boomer podcasters. Yes, today I'm reviewing Scott Galloway's Notes on Being a Man, published today, November 5th, with Simon & Schuster. Now, those of you who haven't run into Scott Galloway must be blissfully offline, maybe in a cabin in the woods, unplugged from the discourse, building mutual aid networks on behalf of all of us terminally online folks. And I salute you, because Galloway is everywhere. He's an entrepreneur, a marketing professor at New York University's Stern Business School. He's got best-selling books out there. He's got an estimated net worth of $100 million, perhaps more. And he hosts or co-hosts multiple podcasts, including Pivot, the Professor G Pod with several spin-offs like Office Hours, and also a podcast called Raging Moderates. And collectively, these broadcasts reach millions of listeners per month. Galloway was born in 1964. He was raised by a single mom. He was a self-described scrawny, gawky, pimply, latchkey kid who was unlikely to succeed until he found his appetite for money, his gift for gregariousness, and his ability to tell good stories. And today, he rides a tidal wave of parasocial capital as a kind of go-to common sense guy who gets tapped by what remains of mainstream liberal news outlets for anything and everything. So if there's a new round of tariffs from Trump, some news producer is going to have him on speed dial for comment. And when Charlie Kirk gets murdered, Anderson Cooper brings him on to make sense of it all as the podcast giant who is pivoting from business and tech commentary to troubled young men whisperer. Now, why is this book an Antifascist Dad podcast subject? Listeners to this young show will know that every week I do a Fasci Dad of the Week segment, and they might be wondering if that's what I'm implying here. But the answer is no. Scott Galloway is not at all a fascist dad. Far from it. In fact, on a psychological and even a spiritual level, there's a lot of really solid, even admirable material in this book. But from the perspective of political economy and history, Galloway's book will do little to challenge the rise of fascism, as much as I think he wants it to. In fact, I'm going to argue that it eloquently, poetically, and quite unconsciously perpetuates the attitudes and assumptions and values that eventually lead to capitalist crisis and inevitable fascist repression. And that's why I'd put Galloway and his book in the squishy center category. And my feeling is that it's just as important, if not more, to understand squish politics as it is to understand far-right politics, which are easier to identify. It's important to ID and rip apart the outright fascist sympathizers like Jordan Peterson, because they have enjoyed mainstream success to the extent that their shtick on self-reliance and Jungian mythology has broad appeal. But over time, the real fascists always expose themselves as broken clowns, and that limits their influence to the right-wing echo chamber. High-quality squishes, on the other hand, not only fail to strongly oppose fascism, but they have strong centrist appeal. You're never going to catch them discrediting themselves with outright bigotry, anti-vax rhetoric, climate denial, anti-intellectualism, or bootlicking tyrants. And they will do some good things, like acknowledge racism, sexism, and wealth inequality. But when push comes to shove, the squishes instinct, and whether this is due to a lack of imagination or to the desire to protect their own positions within society, it's never quite clear. It's to defend the liberal capitalist status quo. And that's the main work that I believe Galloway's book does. Now, I've had about 2.5 months with this book, which is a really good amount of time to sit with it and give it a really fair reading, which I hope will come through in this review. And I think spending that time was worth it because Galloway does something complex here. So, shout out, by the way, to the Simon & Schuster publicity department for sending me a review copy so early. And that was even after I picked apart the reactionary nostalgia and blind spots and gender essentialism of the podcast project that beta tested Galloway's content. So this is during this past summer, Galloway co-produced a limited series called Lost Boys with his friend Anthony Scaramucci. And I reviewed it on 2 episodes of Conspirituality Podcast, and the series was called Galloway and the Mooch, The Lost Boys of Capitalism. So I'll put links to that in the show notes. The good news is that the book is a lot better than that podcast series. Maybe because it's not co-written with Scaramucci, and sorry, Mooch, you were the dead weight on that podcast. But then the bad news is that the book is a lot better than the podcast. Okay, to start, I'm going to summarize the text using Galloway's core hook. So the notes referred to in the title are 44 in number, and they're distributed as kind of like crystalline points of wisdom over 10 chapters that mix memoir, pop sociology, and evo-psych takes as Galloway recounts his Don Juan-esque journey towards capitalist tycoonship, in which he passes through phases of disillusionment, depression, and shame towards the achievement of paternal wisdom. Now, his philosophy and personal story are so integrated in this book that I think the title really could have been Notes on Being Scott Galloway, which I think would jive well with his business training and academic credentials as a branding expert. Now, to give you a taste of how these notes hit, here are the first 3. Note: there's no such thing as toxic masculinity. That's the emperor of all oxymorons. There's cruelty, criminality, bullying, predation, and abuse of power. If you're guilty of any of these things, or conflate being male with coarseness and savagery, you're not masculine, you're anti-masculine. Okay, so that's on page 3, bruh. He basically opens with a straw man diss on feminist discourse. And I'll say more about that one in a bit and what it tells us about his sourcing. Okay, note number 2. It's a simple one. I'm still learning. There is a lot of self-deprecation in this book. Galloway struts his accomplishments, but he also confesses his sins. He touts his workaholism, but he also pins it on his insecurities. He strokes his own ego, but periodically also dissolves it into Zen-like humility. And as refreshing as all this seeming transparency is, I also think it allows him to plausibly deny that he's setting himself up as a guru when, well, he kind of is. Okay, third note. Most boys come apart when a male role model leaves. If there is no father present, the son is more likely to be incarcerated than graduate from college. Okay, pretty stark. But Galloway provides no citation for either of those 2 sentences. And when I dig into the first one, which is most boys come apart when a male role model leaves, I find there are studies to support the statement, but unsurprisingly, this is because there are more studies on this specifically than there are on the effects on a child of any gender losing a role model of any gender. When I researched the second statement, I found that if a father is incarcerated, this is correlated to a son's likelihood to be incarcerated over graduating from college. But in other instances of paternal absence, like divorce, sickness, and in the future, I guess we're going to have to throw in kidnapping by ICE, the correlation is a lot weaker. Galloway doesn't define the reason for absence here, but he does use the word leave, which makes it sound voluntary. Now, here's a two-sentence note that packs a punch and strikes a chord. Like, it brought me up short, and I wanted to look into it. And I think that's because the absent father trope is a cultural trigger point. But putting rhetoric above nuance obscures the mirror version of this equation, which is that boys raised by a single father, where the mother is absent through incarceration, sickness, or death, typically also see lower educational and mental health outcomes than those raised in intact nuclear families. So this gives an indication of Galloway's often reductive technique in this book, which is to take complex human problems and just mash them through the meat grinder of gender anxiety. Now, I want to note that my copy is filled with underlined passages and marginalia and the acronym FC for fact check, because there are a lot of strong claims like this, and they're made with similarly evocative sentences. And I think every one of them should be endnoted, but the endnotes are kind of thin. And I chose against taking the fact-checking route for this review, not only because Galloway is honest about lacking qualifications in sociology and gender, but also because I believe his arguments will be valued for their affect more than anything else. But given this one passage about the consequences of an absent father and how much he leaves out of the tagline, plus his reliance on Richard Reeves, who also is not a trained social scientist, and yet he's an acclaimed expert on boys, I do hope that somebody at some point goes through the claims and the sparse citations more thoroughly than I have. So those are the first three notes, and the notes form the backbone of the book. And analyzed together, all 44 provide a solid microcosm of Galloway's themes, which I can boil down to 5. First, there's a reframing of masculinity, not as inherently dangerous, but as distorted when corrupted by cruelty or power abuse. This pushback against feminist discourse is pretty common in Manosphere light spaces, but Galloway does avoid reactionary rhetoric by stressing kindness, fatherhood, and responsibility. Secondly, this book is a hymn to meritocratic liberalism. Work hard, fail fast, take care of your body, manage trade-offs through balancing grit and self-help. Third, there's a heavy use of capitalist productivity metaphors. Boys must learn to produce surplus value, Galloway says, and gain momentum using forward-looking indicators. So he transplants business terms into personal life, and this is a hallmark of his crossover from MBA classroom to mass self-help. Now, with some exceptions, it seems like Galloway's inner world is just fully colonized by capitalist thought. Next is pro-family traditionalism. There's lots of content in this book emphasizing the role of fathers, marriage stability, and male protection of women. And lastly, love and kindness are offered as a counterweight to the alpha tropes. The repeated refrain is about love, affection, kindness, and making others feel safe. And this positively distinguishes him from harder-edged manosphere influencers. I'm going to spend most of this review unpacking the politics of these broad points, which unfortunately overshadow the straightforward advice he drops in throughout the text. I do think this is a feature of men's self-help writing. There are these no-brainer best practices that most people would actually agree on that take very little time to write out and to list. you can't make a book out of them, and so they get padded with all kinds of social commentary that carry all kinds of political messages. So reasonable bits get hidden like Easter eggs and fool people into thinking the Easter egg hunt was interesting. I mean, who can argue with Jordan Peterson saying clean your room? It's all of the stuff around it that's the problem. So here are Galloway's main bits of advice boiled down to 5 points. He wants boys to cultivate physical and mental strength, exercise regularly, prioritize health, build resilience. The goal is to build confidence and the ability to protect others. I'll get to protection in a moment. Secondly, prioritize genuine relationships. Seek unconditional love, foster strong friendships, and actively engage with family. His argument is that true happiness stems from deep personal connections. Can't argue with that. Thirdly, find your talent and work diligently. Discover what you excel at, apply consistent effort, take calculated risks, and learn from failures to achieve professional success. Next is practice surplus value and generosity. Give more than you receive. He does this within his sort of capitalist metaphorical language. Acknowledge your privileges, create opportunities for others, and act as a protector for family and community. Then lastly, limit addictive digital consumption. Reduce excessive screen time, especially from social media and pornography, to avoid isolation and so that you can nurture real-world skills and interactions. All okay. Solid pieces of advice. So why this book at this time? Galloway pretty much announces in the introduction that he's trying to punch back against the Trumpian patriarchy and its influence on young men. He writes, quote, "I believe the 2024 election was about struggling young people, especially struggling young men. If your son is in the basement vaping and playing video games, you don't really care about trans athletes or territorial sovereignty in Ukraine. You just want change. That is, chaos and disruption." Seeing this, the Trump campaign flew into the Manosphere with coarse language, crypto, Rogan, UFC, and Hulk Hogan. Donald Trump gained 16% with young men in 2024, the biggest pivot from Democrats to Republicans of any age group. Another big shift was among women aged 46 to 64, who I believe are the mothers of struggling young men. The election was supposed to be a referendum on women's rights. It was instead a referendum on failing young men, unquote. So this gives a point of view on how Galloway might position himself or be positioned in the Democrat consultancy class in the horse race to 2028, and also who he's writing for, while ostensibly but not really writing for everyone. So I'll say more about who this book is for in a bit. He's describing a parent here that I've never met before. An erstwhile Democrat or cultural Democrat who's disgusted enough with their boys vaping and gaming that they feel compelled to vote for Trump because Trump will motivate their son, I guess? And how is that working out? Is it motivating to watch immigrants black fanned or missiles fall on Iran? I suppose that $50,000 signing bonus to join up with ICE is pretty motivating at this point. And for Galloway, there's a personal aspect here. He doesn't mention this in the book, and I'm not sure why, but on the Lost Boys podcast, he does say that he's got a son in the basement vaping and gaming. Now, he hasn't definitively said who he voted for in 2024, but he did endorse Harris during the campaign, and he's been a consistent critic of Trump. But whoever's son we're talking about, isn't it possible that the vaping and gaming kid feels depressed or frozen over the state of the world, and the last thing they need is more chaos and disruption? Galloway is also describing a parent who doesn't have any larger or global concerns. No climate terror, no commitments of solidarity to marginalized groups, a parent who doesn't really clock or care about attacks on trans people. Maybe the kid in the basement is gender curious and is afraid of the world as it is now. Galloway's also writing for a crowd for whom the genocide in Gaza is so off the radar he doesn't even bother to mention it in the electoral section, or the political influence of Israel throughout the entire book, even though he leans heavily on America's geopolitical influence as something his readers should be grateful for, and that their sons should develop patriotism to protect. The advanced reading copy shipped with a letter from Stephanie Frerick, who's the vice president, executive editor at the book's publisher, Simon & Schuster. And the house is betting long on this book. I haven't seen a VP letter like that in any other advanced reading copy that I've ever gotten. And Frerick, with this letter, sets the tone for how I believe the book will be read, received, and deployed. Quote, "My greatest hope is that Notes on Being a Man inspires a larger conversation around masculinity, gender, equality, and how patriarchy harms men, too. With Scott's guidance, I believe we can rise to the challenge so that everyone can thrive." Unquote. At the risk of sounding nitpicky here, I want to flag a few things. So, inspiring a larger conversation is classic podcast talk. Not bad in itself, but it's worth noting that the podcast world, and I'm no exception here, can really drown in talking and storytelling and emoting and sharing and hand-wringing. And that's Galloway's job as a podcaster. But for a business professor who's also concerned about material conditions for young men, the talking part kind of overshadows the fact that the book advocates for, only really two concrete policy suggestions. One is to boost the minimum wage to $25 an hour. That's awesome. And the other is to advocate for better housing infrastructure. Also a really good idea. Now, Frerick has the feminist chops to give a nod at bellhooks here with her line about how patriarchy harms men. Now, if you don't know Hooks, this is the more complete quote that she famously put out there. Quote, "The first act of violence that patriarchy demands of males is not violence toward women. Instead, patriarchy demands of all males that they engage of acts of psychic self-mutilation, that they kill off the emotional parts of themselves. If an individual is not successful in emotionally crippling himself, he can count on patriarchal men to enact rituals of power that will assault his self-esteem." That's from The Will to Change, Men, Masculinity, and Love, 2004. Galloway doesn't really talk much about patriarchy in an explicit way in this book. The word patriarchal does appear once, and he's clear about realities like male privilege, and he criticizes the emotional rigidity that can be a feature of masculine conditioning. But he doesn't quote Hooks or any feminist writer. The references are mostly, as I said, pop science, evo-psych, policy wonk stuff, pop economics, health stuff, and internet news. He's transparent about his lack of expertise. He's not learning anything in this book that ultimately he finds challenging. He's really curating his own common sense vision. But unfortunately, this goes farther than just overlooking the sources for his evolving common sense. So do you remember that first note? Let me just read it again. "There's no such thing as toxic masculinity. That's the emperor of all oxymorons. There's cruelty, criminality, bullying, predation, and abuse of power. If you're guilty of any of these things or conflate being male with coarseness and savagery, you're not masculine, you're anti-masculine." Okay, so let's get this straight. Toxic masculinity is a structural critique of patriarchal conditioning, and in many ways, especially in the home stretch of this very book, Galloway rails against it. So what he's doing here is he's co-opting the substance of a cultural critique while misreading its source. And he does it with a verbal trick. Toxic masculinity cannot exist, according to Galloway, because masculinity as a term must in his thinking have a transcendent and eternal meaning that is always already good. So it's kind of dishonest, I think, to ignore that toxic is a qualifier describing a quality within a category. I don't think it's worthy of someone who has a professorship at NYU, to be honest. Now, I'll return to this straw man problem later. It's a little bit of a habit, unfortunately. Not throughout the book, but in the all-important framing of why he's writing it, because the whole thing hinges on the notion of boys being in crisis, and that, in turn, hinges on inventing ways in which Galloway thinks that boys are uniquely being overlooked or abandoned or being regarded with contempt. Now, if my thesis holds true that this book will stand in for actual policy substance in the Democratic Party's quest to speak to American men, I believe we're going to see a lot of liberal sources doing that citational work on Galloway's behalf to make it sound like he's more progressive than he is. Because for it to have political traction, they will need to make it seem like Galloway is fluent in some feminist discourse, even as he avoids the most basic conclusions of feminist politics with regard to issues like unpaid labor. Now, why is that? Because liberal centrist capitalism needs punditry that acknowledges, as Galloway does, that unpaid caregiving actually keeps capitalist systems alive, but that the answer to this gendered inequality is not paying for unpaid labor or providing universal health care or child care, but rather encouraging men to do more cooking and to say thank you more to their partners. They need someone who can be honest about the contradictions of capitalism and their impact on gender, because everyone can increasingly see them, and they need someone who's very persuasive about the limited crumbs of relief that are politically feasible in their view. And those crumbs really boil down to bootstraps pep talks. This is the moral hook of liberalism. Implore people to behave better so that you don't really have to interrogate the broader exploitative logic. Now, further, I'm going to predict that the people who do the hooks washing of Galloway's book will be liberal or even progressive women because they know the material, and perhaps because that's what they really want Galloway to be saying, even if he's not. Most generously, they might be trying to encourage a more radical reading of a centrist book so that it becomes a kind of Trojan horse. This book might get Galloway onto Rogan again, they're thinking, and that's a doorway for a richer conversation and so on. I don't really buy it. Now, there are similar dynamics at play with the racial politics of this book. Galloway rues the casual workplace racism he witnessed during his time at Morgan Stanley, and he does have some solid paragraphs about how wealth inequality in general impacts black men and boys more acutely. But there's no real discussion of history, origins, redlining mortgages, why any of this has happened, reparations, any of that. And without that, we're really left with, the admonishment that individuals should try to be less racist. Now, there are policy suggestions, as I said, a $25 an hour minimum wage and more work on housing, and those would be moves in the right direction in relation to racial inequality generally, but Galloway's bibliography is overwhelmingly white, mainstream, and policy health-oriented. It includes a handful of race-conscious policy and justice sources, some of which feature black or brown writers, but it doesn't contain any kind of, race theory texts or major works from black or other marginalized writers. It's a bibliography, I think, that will be familiar to those who know mainstream liberal Democrat politics over the past decades, in which, you want to talk about racism enough to signal that you know it's a thing, and in which you want to keep telling that demographic that you're seeing them and feeling them while offering very little when it comes to material repair. So, that's it for Frerich's note. I think her note is significant, and that's what I pull out of her endorsement here, along with the fact that she's 45, so she's almost millennial. She's right on the Gen X millennial line. I don't bring up her age to allude to skill or competence at all, but to note that my reading of Galloway is that it's written by a boomer, and it's going to track best for his fellows, but also centrist Gen X readers. But he has to get millennial buy-in, especially from women. When Frerich refers to Scott's guidance as though he's a confessor, and she uses his first name as if he's a friend, that's the parasocial hook. The persona of the elder guru is locked in. So, what is Guru Galloway's core thesis on being a man? Right after that paragraph about how mothers of boys voted for Trump because reasons, Galloway writes, quote, "Despite the significant age difference between my sons and me, I believe there are certain givens about what it means to be male. Most don't date or expire. I think of masculinity as a three-legged stool. Those legs provide a path forward for boys and men today. In answer to the questions, why are men here and what do men do, the answer is threefold. Men protect, provide, and procreate." So, did I mention that Galloway is a branding expert? Here we see him at work. This is a tagline to launch 1,000 memes. And it's not just alliterative with the P's. All three words start with pro. Like, this is really engineered in some language lab for maximum hookiness. Now, if you watch Galloway in his role as a go-to commentator on network news, you'll see a guy who stays relentlessly on message. So with any question about anything from the stock market to campus protests, he's always going to come back to his strongest talking points about toxic social media algorithms and unfair wealth transfers from younger generations to older generations. Now, in this book, he's similarly disciplined. He clings tightly to this protect, provide, and procreate triad throughout. I'm almost, willing to bet that he engineered this with a formalistic constraint that every few pages should ping and tie these three concepts together. And what's really effective about having these three legs of the stool and knowing how to switch between them deftly is that most readers won't have the time to slow things down enough to examine them. So that's what I'm going to do here. First of the three legs, protect. Galloway makes a lot of hay out of the gifts and obligations bestowed by the holy molecule of testosterone, which he admits to taking as a supplement at this point in his mid-60s. So this is the muscle and virility builder to be enhanced in the gym and then exercised on the dating scene. But the ultimate purpose of T, according to Galloway, is to protect the vulnerable. Quote, "A man's default setting should be to move to protect in any situation," he writes. However, the way he tells it, this instinct tracks with his deep memories of being raised by his single mother on her secretary's salary, with poverty hunting them both like a ghost. A pivotal moment in his self-esteem, in fact, dawns when he realizes that he can protect her health and peace of mind by staying out of trouble. And then later, when she's ill with cancer and he's come into his first flush of money, he's able to provide more protection. Quote, "I was finally making enough money to do things like that for her. It was an incredibly rewarding feeling, a big moment to be able to do that for my mom, who had always worked so hard to support me. It was one of the first times I remember feeling like a real man," unquote. So his core model for providing protection is his mother, which means his description of developing an essential male protectiveness skill is actually about mutual aid, or starting to do for her what she did for him. And then later, when he gets into some really solid material about learning how to love his children unconditionally, his mom is standing in the background there as well as an inspiration. Next leg, provide. So this pattern repeats with providing because here his values also refer back to his mother's sacrifices. And then in his present life, he writes eloquently about how his partner, Beata, who he describes as being a high-earning professional, is everything to their son. Quote, "She's his world, his ibuprofen, his neosporin, his shock absorber, the patch to his busted rowboat." I mean, sometimes he can really turn a phrase, and I'll give him that. In pure economic terms, Galloway does recognize that women are increasingly primary earners in families and that sometimes men need to get out of their way. So he's able to be faithful to the shifting sociological data while also nursing the anxiety that if men do not feel the reward and status of being able to provide, everything's going to fall apart. But there's not a lot here that tells us about gender. And so what is this argument really about? And my guess is that Galloway is using it to talk about his own thorny journey towards self-esteem. There's kind of a vibe of retconning here. The guy who's now worth over $100 million is reaching for an evolutionary explanation for why he had to amass such wealth, even as he's surrounded by and inspired by women who are providing just as much as he does, or even more. Third leg, procreate. The third stool leg, sorry for the pun, men are here to procreate. But what does this have to do with gender? And what if you don't want kids? And what if it's not for you? There's honestly not a lot here beyond some hackneyed ideas of the young, dumb, and full of cum guy variety. At one point, he says that, quote, men have more than double the brain space and processing power devoted to sexual drive. And then he quite confidently claims that for women, desire consists mainly of wanting to be wanted. Now, he doesn't provide citations for either statement, and it's just as well, because both are sexist, pseudoscientific bullshit that reinforce stereotypes of men as horn dogs and women as sexually passive. But hey, if that's the way women are, then of course you have to protect and provide for them, right? So while Galloway is pretty focused on sex in ways that really just further these hackneyed stereotypes, the generous thing I can say about this writing is that he ties these views, along with protection and providing, to a vision of loyalty in relationships. Now, he's not a moralist about monogamy, but he is committed to sexual attraction and compatibility and loyalty being foundational to the family bonds that he would want all young people to have. And along these lines, he repeats something throughout the book that I think is reparative in relation to his own life with his own father, who he describes as a charismatic but disloyal deadbeat. Galloway insists that the best thing a father can do for his sons is to treat their mother with love and respect. So this runs throughout the book. He actually ends with it. It's his last line in the book. And so it all comes back to the mother. And I'm betting that for many readers, this valuing of loyalty and the perennial grace of mothers, and Galloway's mom in particular, shining over his shoulder, will obscure the overall sexual politics of this book. So here's a question. If Galloway's core thesis that men are uniquely built to protect, provide, and procreate doesn't really hold water as a gendered argument, what is he actually doing here? Is he holding up these basic human drives as aspirations for a demographic of men he sees as not living up to them? Is it a persuasion technique? Is he saying to young men, hey, these generally good qualities about being a human being will also make you a manly man? Is the idea that they wouldn't buy in otherwise? I mean, maybe, partly, but I don't think that this is solely a rhetorical device. I think Galloway is a true believer in the gender binary. And the giveaway for me is the resentful framing in the introduction. So here's one of those straw man volleys that I mentioned previously. Quote, "Why are we so averse to identifying and celebrating what's good about men and masculinity, and why does it matter?" Unquote. Okay, who is he asking here? You know, a small contingent of online leftists who are just blunt in their language about patriarchy and misogyny? Aren't men being elevated and validated and praised and given power and publishing deals and podcasts all the time? He goes on, quote, "We won't prosper if we convince boys and young men that they're victims, or that they don't have to be persistent and resilient, or that their perspective isn't valuable. If we do, we'll end up with a society of old people and zero economic growth." Okay, I'll just pause quickly here, because remember how I said he's always pinging his 3 Ps, protect, provide, and procreate? This is one of many examples. He's basically saying that without feeling bodily strength and economic confidence, men won't want to have sex, and then there's no babies, right? Okay, he goes on, quote, "If we can't convince young men of the honor involved and the unique contributions inherent in expressing what makes them male, we'll lose them to niche, rabid online communities. Young men were instrumental in some of the most seminal events of the 20th century, many, if not all of which, required collective effort, incredible bravery, risk-taking, aggression, and sacrifice. Can we acknowledge how extraordinarily important, skilled, strong, and decent most young men were, carrying out the roles they played in helping create the world we live in? Unquote. Okay, again, who is he speaking to? Who is not acknowledging the work of men through history, especially given his example? So he goes on to note that the Empire State Building was raised at speed by thousands of skilled tradesmen. He talks about how the Hoover Dam was built under lethal heat to power the Southwest and store water. And then he talks about World War II's Normandy landings and the Battle of the Bulge, where young soldiers endured brutal conditions to defeat fascism. Here's a quote: "When Germans or Russians are streaming over the border or firing from the beach, big dick energy isn't just a nice idea. It's fucking mandatory." So that's Galloway. Sometimes he really likes to write big dick energy sentences. That's one of them. And then he goes on to reframe the American mid-century middle class as a state-enabled reward for veterans' masculine excellence. In other words, after World War II, policies like the GI Bill, FHA loans, and highway building funneled resources to millions of formerly uniformed men, which, combined with their perceived heroism, helped catalyze marriage, family formation, and stable households. So in this telling, post-war prosperity emerged from aligning public investment with admired male roles, which Galloway calls peak male. Now, he doesn't mention how unevenly this was all distributed. He doesn't talk about the fact that Black veterans came home from abroad and were routed through segregated facilities and faced widespread street violence from whites who feared that they would suddenly campaign for civil rights. Overall, it's a very Stan Lee MCU cartoon vision of history with some Tom Hanks thrown in. And there are some weird blind spots in it, too. So the Empire State Building and Hoover Dam examples don't tell us much about other forms of gendered labor at the time. So writing about the Hoover Dam, he says, quote, "Around 20,000 men showed up in Las Vegas to begin work a year after the Great Depression in 100-plus degree weather. 16 workers died of heat prostration, countless others from carbon monoxide poisoning." So all of this is true, but is this the bravery and sacrifice that he's talking about that is somehow unique to masculinity? Isn't this about men made desperate enough to work in deadly conditions by the system he spends most of his book praising? Now, on the war stuff, does he honestly think that the culture at large doesn't talk enough about the experience of men in World War II? Like, has he missed that a major chunk of Hollywood is dedicated to exactly that time period and the men who lived through it? Also, why are Russians fighting in the Battle of the Bulge? Is he talking about the Soviets invading somewhere else? And anyway, whether they're German or Russian or American, whether they have big dicks or little dicks, aren't they all in war hell? What happened to the brave Russians who survived Stalingrad? Did they enjoy a victory surplus? Galloway's vision of peak male greatest generation bravado seems to have almost nothing to do with willpower or gendered accomplishment, but it's battlefield luck, enhanced or diminished by access to oil and war machinery. And then really it's just textbook American exceptionalism to note that the war surplus sparked an economic surge that helped the middle class explode without acknowledging that whatever prosperity ensued was enforced by Cold War militarism around the world. I want to give two more examples of straw men here. Both of them push the Manosphere line that parents are just too soft on their kids these days. So the first one starts off with a section on the benefits of going to college and joining a frat house if you're a dude. So Galloway writes, quote, "A recent American theme is that our kids don't need college, that college doesn't matter. This is a blatant lie that parents tell themselves to feel better. Find me someone who tells a child you don't need college, and I'll show you a parent who would eat their own legs if their kid got into Harvard." Okay, so I'm not sure where this is coming from. I've never heard anybody say anything like that. And it seems that he's oversimplifying the varied and often legitimate reasons that families might question the necessity or affordability of college. He portrays these views as disingenuous and self-deceptive rather than reasoned considerations. But there's also some hypocrisy here because he talks repeatedly throughout the book about the sheer luck he had in getting a free ride to UCLA. Now, he does say that current tuition costs in the US are indefensible, but he doesn't suggest any actual policy like universal tuition or debt cancellation. Then there's a grade school straw man straight out of the participation trophy discourse. Galloway argues that, quote, a phony, feel-good school ecosystem with its lack of emphasis on fitness leads to the 8th winningest kid lining up to receive a trophy, and this is actively bad for young men. And he claims it tells them that nothing is their fault, and they're responsible for their successes but not their failures, that they can sit passively by and still be winning. Really? Is this something you heard somewhere, Scott? I really wonder. There aren't any direct quotes that I can find in the endnotes. There's nothing that you're citing. It sounds like something that you heard Matt Walsh say to Ben Shapiro. And so Galloway portrays efforts at inclusion of promoting self-esteem in youth activities as detrimental, as fostering a sense of entitlement and lack of accountability. And he does so rather than acknowledging the potential benefits of more balanced approaches. And this is part of the implicitly ableist thread that also runs throughout the text. And it's implicit because he never mentions disability or neurodiversity as facts of life that require accommodation from a caring society. And that silence speaks volumes. So on that note, I can turn to who this book is for. And I can definitely say that this book is not written for my sons, even though they are as white as Scott's sons, and they may share some cultural references. The Steam video game platform, for example, can be a surprising class leveler, even if my kids are not being brought up in unimaginable wealth. Galloway has an irritating habit of dropping little details like he flies with his kids to Scotland and Paris and Barcelona to go to football matches, for example. And around here, if we get to go out for a few hours of pick your own apples and the van doesn't break down, we are winning at life. So even without the massive wealth differences, however, my kids would find very little of use in this book because there's no part of it that acknowledges the gifts and challenges of neurodiversity. There's nothing in it that challenges the basic assumptions around complying with the demands of capitalist education. The assumption throughout is that the world is simply the world and that boys must learn to adapt and comply with its demands. Now, I could write a whole other review of the 6th chapter of this book in which Galloway compiles all of his health advice with little regard to the assumptions of ableism or the social determinants of health. Now, as an aside, and this might be a little bit harsh in relation to Galloway or any book in particular, but I'm just going to say it. I don't think anyone should presume to write about kids or parenting if they haven't been through the practice of caring for a child with high support needs. Not because I think doing that work makes you a better person or because a writer should constantly be thinking about a minority within their readership. I just think it should be a requirement because nothing else will show you so clearly who our society is built for than watching a neurodivergent kid try to navigate it. And then beyond that, it also shows you what you yourself have complied with throughout your entire life. And that can force you to ask the question, was that right for me? Is this right for anybody? And this is why I think there are so many late diagnosed folks out there now, especially women. Many really look into their own experience after they have their own kid assessed. And recognizing the support needs of a child, I think, is a doorway to recognizing one's own support needs. Ultimately, Notes on Being a Man is written for the well-off parents of mainly white, able-bodied, straight boys who they see as struggling but worthy and even deserving competitors in the American meritocracy. So I anticipate many simpatico, warm interviews with top-tier, six-figure news hosts who share Galloway's class zone. But Galloway is also wise enough to say the following about the flawed idea of meritocracy. So this is in a section about having had service jobs when he was in high school and college. He writes, quote, "In the United States, the concept of meritocracy has a dark side. If you don't end up working at Goldman Sachs and living in Brooklyn Heights and socializing at the hottest clubs, the message is plain. You screwed up. It's your fault." Such bullshit. My coworkers saved money by living together in small quarters and sent most of their paychecks home to their families in Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. They worked harder than me and spoke better English. But I was born a white, straight man in Laguna Niguel, California, and I realized life in the United States isn't a meritocracy or even close. Yes, individuals have agency, but some individuals have more than others. Service work is an anti-meritocracy vaccine, a reminder that the American dream for some people is closer to a hallucination, given how many people sleep with one eye open, worrying about how they're going to pay for their kids' asthma medication, unquote. So this is great, but it also sounds like a polished Democratic politician who sees and feels your pain. Because again, what does he advise in terms of policy to mitigate the fact that American meritocracy isn't real? He's got the minimum wage thing and better housing, but he doesn't talk about universal health care, which would cover asthma medication, or any other socialization of services. Here's what he does suggest, however, and this gives you a very clear sense of who the book is written for. Note, every young man should work a service job at least once. It's a vaccine against the idea of meritocracy. You also gain empathy. Now, this sounds like really solid advice until you realize he's spotlighting how narrow his readership really is. Like, he's advising kids like his to do a little bit of labor tourism in their lives so they might get a glimpse of how the other side lives. Now, while the goal is empathy to incentivize the creation of surplus value, his, favorite sort of capitalist psychological phrase, he doesn't take it any farther than that. He doesn't suggest, for example, that this labor LARPing should encourage kids to work for social justice. The imagined kid here is clearly someone with a parachute, a kid who can be bailed out. That's who he's writing for. Kids who can dip their toes into how the other half lives and be back in time for the weekend at the cottage. Now, as an aside, this passage reminds me about how when the autistic French anti-fascist mystic Simone Weil was a tween, their parents took them on holiday and they spent their time talking to the hotel staff about their working conditions. So they missed the beach walks and croquet while talking to the workers about forming a union. Galloway also turns the poverty tourism outwards when he writes the following, quote, "I'm not sure young Americans altogether appreciate their blessings and opportunities relative to living elsewhere, or how many people have made sacrifices to ensure those rights and protections. Send 100 college sophomores to the worst, most embattled parts of the world, interview them afterward, see what they say. Most, if not all, will be on the first flight home," unquote. Okay, so he really packs a lot into that passage. There's rationalizing foreign wars. There's walking right up to the edge of using the Trumpian shithole countries line. And he's also brushing up against the old Cold War and Gulf War propaganda that somehow U.S. troops go out into the world to protect rights at home. And so this is as good a time as any to flag that patriotism is a core aspect of being a man for Galloway. He actually pings it throughout the text, saying it's an essential part of his personal code. And to be honest, this is the only bit of the book that feels a little bit out of character. He doesn't describe any military experience or friends in the military or family members who are veterans. It kind of feels like fear of missing out or pandering, maybe. It's the one moment in the book that sounds like he's plotting a path to a political run and he's trying to ingratiate himself. It's important enough, though, that in the book's closing letter to his sons, he urges them to adopt the spirit of patriotism and to vow to protect the country. Now, it's not a blood and soil thing for Galloway. It's more linked to a sense that this is the country where he got lucky, and he should remember that. And this brings me to one last thing about his politics, which is a kind of historical naivety. And I first picked up on this in the Lost Boys podcast when Scaramucci makes this bizarre comment about Henry Ford, quote, "And as wicked of a person as Henry Ford was, he did say something brilliant about social engineering. He said, I want to make sure that these workers can afford the car or the product that they're manufacturing, and I got to make sure they're in a single-family home with a good school, because I don't want any of them descending on my Dearborn mansion with tiki torches and pitchforks, and I think that's being masculine." So the mooch leaves out a bunch of stuff here. He leaves out the part about how Ford also brutalized labor unions. He leaves out the part about Ford's so-called service department, who were the 3,000 goons he hired to beat up on, or in one case, machine gun men striking for fairer wages. He leaves out the part about Ford loving Hitler and his German subsidiary making trucks for the Reich that carried soldiers that killed Americans. Now, Galloway isn't as simple-minded as the mooch, but he does default to some cringe resources in his appeal for a return to the disciplined masculinity of old. For instance, he speaks longingly of Robert Baden-Powell, the founder of the Boy Scouts, which he enjoyed attending as a kid. Quote, "The former British Army officer and rumored spy was raised as I was by a strong mother," he writes. "His own dad died when he was 3. He gave his mom credit for everything. Be prepared doubles as his initials. It also meant he expected boys to be in a constant state of readiness in mind and body to do their duty, whatever it might be. Great advice for men of any age." So Galloway is not a historian, but if you're going to write an inspo book for young men in a time of fascism, it's worth looking more deeply into your heroes and sources. Baden-Powell was a colonial officer in Africa, and his books were full of racist and anti-Semitic slurs. His magnum opus, Scouting for Boys, explicitly encourages loyalty to the British Empire and lauds adventurers and scouts as heroes of divinely ordained imperial conquest. Now, the other shitheel from the 1890s that Galloway points to is Rudyard Kipling, by quoting the famous poem If, which Kipling wrote only a few years before he wrote The White Man's Burden. So what am I saying here? Does Galloway secretly harbor colonialist attitudes? No. It's more like he's carrying big chunks of his culture around with him unquestioned. It's a liberal culture of laundering history to cherry-pick bits of inspo. It's not a huge deal, but it does show that Galloway's radar for the roots of fascism is pretty dim. In the home stretch here, I want to bring things back to the problem of contradiction. The majority of the book is preoccupied with encouraging young men to follow in his workaholic footsteps and employ his capitalism tips and tricks for fun and profit. But the minority of the book concentrates on telling men how to spiritually recover from the moral injury of capitalism. There's a real detox before the retox rhythm to it. It's advice on how to survive, but not change or even really question an abusive system. So let me ground the contradictions in a few standout quotes. There's a sequence in his origin story in which Galloway writes, quote, "Both my parents took huge risks coming to America. Why? Because they wanted to work their asses off and be rewarded for the risks they were willing to take. This is capitalism. a promise of prosperity for people who are smart, hardworking, and comfortable with risk, promising a greater share of the spoils than to those who are not. Okay, then at the end of a very muscular brofluencer section in which Galloway extends his family legacy by coaching young men to become more fit and confident, he writes, quote, "Many of you will have a gag reflex to my boomer capitalist mentality or some such bullshit. No, it's America, a platform to deploy skills and grit to add value and accumulate resources," unquote. So that is the majoritarian voice in this book. Bootstraps American exceptionalism. But then there is the teaspoon of sugar. In the chapter on love and marriage, Galloway writes the following. See if this sounds like the same person. Quote, "Love received is comforting, love reciprocated is rewarding, and love given completely is eternal. You are immortal. Our role, our job as humans is to love someone unconditionally. It's the secret sauce cementing the survival of Homo sapiens. And to ensure we continue this act, nature made it the most rewarding. To love someone completely is the ultimate accomplishment. It tells the universe you matter. The person you love matters. You are an agent of survival, evolution, and life. You are still just a blink of an eye, but the blink matters." 10:10, no notes. And at the end of the book, in a letter he writes to his two sons, we find this, quote, "Let yourself be happy. Be less hard on yourself than I was on myself. I've wasted years and joy focused on what I missed or screwed up versus my blessings and accomplishments. Learn from what I did wrong. Be me plus better. And as a favor to me, try to evolve our family DNA and do something I've struggled with. Acknowledge and embrace the moments of your life as you experience them. It's the only thing we really have, the here, the now." Now, if he's being honest about his personal story, I believe that Galloway earned these two remarks. Remember his reliance on his mother, who survived divorce when he was 7 and raised him on her own, and whose love and encouragement he attributes the seed of his self-esteem to. He also really reflects on hurting a former wife out of puerile selfishness, and he admits to explosive impatience in the home, things that he's had to learn from. Now, the curse of being a branding expert, and I'm sure Galloway's aware of this, is that no one can be sure besides his close people and his therapist, although he admits to never going to therapy, to what extent he's spinning himself. But I think there are solid clues that he's learned a lot of good things, either through good modeling or by examining his own faults. There's this one line in that love and marriage chapter where he's talking about how to care for a partner. This stood out to me. And he mentions that whenever you go out somewhere, you make sure to pack energy bars and a shawl that can double as a pillow. Now, unless he's cribbing notes from progressive Instagram moms on the nitpicky logistics of caregiving, it's hard to fake a detail like that. And then in the section on parenting, he's got a lot of good, mundane, experiential detail about things like the importance of physical affection with young boys and how it can sink a parent into the present moment and let them touch eternity. This is also something that's really hard to fake. At one point, he writes that he got some really important advice from his friend, Sam Harris, because, you know, all Titan podcasters are personal friends, right? Quote, he offered that rather than trying to parent, cajole, discipline, or guide your children, your real purpose is just to love them. So this is great advice. It's the best advice even. Like if you were only allowed one sentence of parenting advice in your life, this would probably cover it. And it hurts my heart to say that it's coming eavesdropped from Sam Harris, somebody I loathe, someone whose Islamophobia has helped pave the way for liberal centrist apathy towards genocide, someone who is utterly incapable of applying that same advice to other people in the world, to other people's children. And this Sam Harris moment really spotlights the paradox of this book for me, that conservative, liberal, or centrist parenting wisdom can be as good as any wisdom out there on the domestic level while remaining completely blind to its broader social implications and moral demands. It reminds me of how the most precious aphorisms of a religion are like honey in the mouths of priests who never really hear or understand their universal call. And I think this is what will make this book so attractive and so useless, unless it inspires the reader to actually dig deeper into the inequalities of capitalism that Galloway seems to accept as destiny. In a book called Anti-Oedipus, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari argue that the contradictions of capitalism mandate a schizophrenic experience of life. Now, this was 1972. They weren't thinking about stigmatizing language, so apologies on their behalf. They say that the promises of entrepreneurial freedom encourage us to break down old rules and traditional ways of life. And this is very much Galloway's jam. He talks about his entrepreneurial bad boy disruptor prowess with great relish. And it's a freedom that purports to allow people's desires to run wild and free. But capitalism simultaneously stops and controls these desires with strict systems of productivity and debt. It's a system that tries to tie down these strong, free-flowing energies, always creating new limits. Capitalism constantly pushes toward a point where everything could break down completely, where the wheels could just fly off, but it also works hard to stop itself from falling apart. It stops or twists the powerful, revolutionary potential of these free desires, turning what could be, a positive breakthrough kind of energy into a negative breakdown energy. Now, if that's too abstract and 70s French for you, we can also just go with Marx's simpler rundown of contradictions, all of which sit unquestioned in the background of Galloway's life and work. We produce stuff collectively, but the profits are privatized. The stuff we produce is not for the common good, but for the profit of the few. The profit motive seeks limitless return, which means ever-increasing levels of exploitation. Marx is describing a mess, and there's no way out of it beyond workers standing up for themselves together. But absent a mass movement or revolution, Marx pointed out that people need coping mechanisms to be able to tolerate these contradictions. And so he focused a lot on religion as a response to the confusion and alienation of capitalist suffering. It was, he said, a form of social control that encouraged emotional surrender to the status quo. It allowed people to endure conditions that are senselessly cruel. So Scott Galloway says that he's an atheist with softening edges as he ages. He says the following, quote, "I've always been skeptical and judgmental. I consider myself a scientist. Religion is easy to poke holes in and contrary to academia. I've come to esteem the role religious institutions play in society and people's lives," unquote. He goes on to say, "The voyage to atheism began with my being curious about religion, then not understanding it, which led to intellectual disdain, like an invisible friend, huh? And now it's ending with respect and humility. Because for most people, religion is a source of comfort, community, and compassion. Seneca believed religion was regarded by the poor as true, the wise as false, and the powerful as useful. But I find the absence of religion and opportunities to congregate with strangers leaves a void. I'm getting older, wanting to serve in the agency of others, to be part of something bigger and register comfort. I do this with my family and the young men I mentor. Is that enough?" It's a really earnest question at the end of the book. And I think the answer for me is I don't think so, because for a podcaster with millions of followers and thinly veiled political aspirations, I think the answer is staring him in the face. He has every opportunity to organize young people around principles of fairness and equality. His gaze is already set on the generations. He's a systems thinker, but he's also hamstrung by his training in the American individualist paradigm. So it's not surprising to me that his fatigue, his disillusionment, his shame seeks a private resolution in reverie. What Galloway offers in the homestretch of his book is a form of religious relief from capitalist chaos, framed through domestic ritual and familial love. So in chapters 7 to 10, this shows up in the form of some legitimate paternal wisdom. So after the adventure of how he navigated capitalism and discovered the hollowness of money, the homestretch amounts to a prayer for forgiveness and atonement. These chapters alone could be the backbone of a strong humanistic meditation on family, loyalty, loss, perseverance, the complexities of love, and the nature of awe and wonder. I think it's the strongest part of the book, but I also think it's the part that will most distract readers from Galloway's political limitations. Here's a peak quote from this spiritual register. Quote, "Supposedly, each of us has in us bits of every material present at the dawn of the universe. It makes sense, at least when ingesting mushroom chocolates, that our matter would also be present in galaxies, stars, planets, and organisms birthed trillions of years from now. Our stories may or may not make the journey, but the emotions they inspire will become instinct, then DNA, and this matter will disperse. So the question is, distinct from the story you and others tell about yourself, how do you make people feel? When people encounter you, do they feel insecure or inspired? Do you leave people cold or comforted? Do you bring joy, harmony, love?" These are really good personal questions, but it wouldn't take that much to increase their scope so that they avoid the cul-de-sac of private consolation that Marx described as the limit of European Protestant spirituality. Did you work with others? That might be a question that could be added. Did you serve the poor? Did you risk everything to overthrow injustice? Did you repair the planet for the next 7 generations? In my work over the last 5 years on Conspirituality Podcast, I've spent a lot of time studying how the MAGA movement has been aided, abetted, and at times even driven by white Christian nationalism, which has often escalated into straight-up Christofascism. Now, in my understanding, this alliance could make Trumpism more robust than earlier forms of fascism, which had more ambivalent relationships to religious institutions. Trumpism is a crass and soulless grift, and Trump is lucky to have evangelicals on board to help add soul and at least try to launder his perversion and cruelty. But how do liberals and centrists and raging moderates, as Galloway calls himself, use spirituality? They don't use it egotistically to authorize their policies like the evangelicals do. They don't use it to cover over their aggression. They use it primarily, I believe, to console themselves inside a bubble of peace floating through a world they've given up on changing. And you can write some beautiful sentences and poems and songs in that bubble, and they can connect with others. And there are lines in this book, like the one about healing the family DNA by learning to actually be present, that connect with me, to the extent that I can imagine enjoying having coffee with Galloway or going for a walk together. And if I did, I think I would ask him, in good faith, you know this capitalist world from top to bottom you're an expert in? You know its promises. You know its deceptions. You've mastered it as much as anyone has. Surely you can figure out a way to turn it inside out. And because he likes stories, maybe I'd tell him some stories about how many revolutionary thinkers and activists back in the day became class traders. How Friedrich Engels was the son of an industrialist. How Alexandra Kollontai was the daughter of a Russian general. And how Peter Kropotkin gave up his aristocratic status and almost all of his wealth to spend his life developing the idea of mutual aid, along with writing essays like 1880s An Appeal to the Young, addressed, as Galloway's book is, to young people struggling with the contradictions of capitalism. So he writes to the young doctor who has realized that health depends actually less on medicine than on not being poor. And he writes to the young lawyer who's sickened by the fact that he's using the law to sue peasants on behalf of landlords. He assumes his privileged young readers are free-thinking, compassionate, and yearning for justice. Kropotkin assumes that they are different from those who just chase pleasure or conform without reflection. He emphasizes the power of education, critical thinking, and continuous action by committed minorities to bring about social transformation. Quote, "To rise from the ranks of the working people," Kropotkin writes, as if to Galloway directly, "and not to devote oneself to bringing about this triumph of socialism is to misconceive the real interests at stake, to give up the cause and the true historic mission." Unquote. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you back here on the main feed. Please like and subscribe so you can follow me here.